So welcome everybody, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ricky Canello, and my pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm the Associate Project Coordinator at the MHCTC Network Coordinating Office based in Palo Alto, California. Next slide. So thank you to those of you who have introduced yourself in the chat box. For those of you who haven't, we want to know, who are you? Where are you from? And what role do you have in supporting school mental health? Next slide. And just to go over a few housekeeping items before today's session, we encourage you to mute your mics when not speaking and to go off video if you are moving. It helps ensure the audio quality for the recording. We do have live captioning available for today's session. You just have to click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information email. If you do have any audio or technical issues during today's session, we have the chat box available for you to communicate with us so we can assist you, and feel free to send us a private chat. We also want to hear what you think about today's event. At the end of today's session, we'll have a link and a QR code for you to take our brief 2-minute survey just to see how we're doing. And we also encourage you to follow us on social media, on Facebook and Twitter at MHTTC Network, and on Instagram at Healing School Communities. Next slide. The MHTTC network is comprised of 13 centers across the US, including 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. After today's session, we suggest that you visit our website and find your regional center to keep in touch with us for more resources and training opportunities, all free of cost. Next slide. A really quick disclaimer, this presentation was prepared by the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this learning session are the views of our speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide. As we set the context for today's session, we'd like to elevate the community norms and ways of engaging that our community of practice is committed to uphold. If there are other things that you might need from our community to feel open and present, we invite you to share them with us. If at any point you have a need surrounding one of our community norms, feel free to reach out to us via private chat. Next slide. Today's meeting is session 5 of 7 of our community of practice that is centered around healing racial violence in school settings. This community is hosted by the MHTTC Network's Healing Racial Violence Teamlet and is made possible by so many people, including all of you participants, as well as our incredible facilitators. We hope you will engage with us through the chat box and Q&A through today's session. Next slide. Our network uses and encourages all to use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in our trainings and events. A reminder that as we engage in conversation today, let's be mindful to use language that is inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences. Next slide. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today's session. Kenjus Watson is a son, brother, nephew, cousin, uncle, father, and partner who often shares space, energy, and dreams with radical educational communities. He aims to root and bridge this work and memories that attest to the inextricable link between the wellness of Black people, our autonomy, and the abolition of school. Kenjus, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn the floor to you.
Hey, peace. Thank you, Ricky, and thank you all really for the blessing and invitation to share space today around the realities of violence within and beyond our school settings and what we might do to interrupt those. I have the honor really of going after and following up on some of the really important groundings and rootings that hopefully many of you all have been engaged with. I want to ground us a bit. Today is a really important day in general, but wanted to give a sense of what we're going to be sort of considering as we talk about, interrupting violence within schools, but more broadly as this series of engagements are organized around the concept of healing school communities. So I know we've had conversations beyond schooling and cultural relevant or culturally responsive frameworks within and through our educational spaces. I'm really interested in helping us today to delineate the difference between schooling and education. I hope that by the end of our brief time together, that'll be more clear. And I wanted to start today by introducing you to one of my uh, first, foremost, and I think ongoing most powerful educators. This is my mom, Terry McGee Watson. And that's me, right? And when I was first introduced to formalized schooling. Today is International Women's Day, according to the at least the state, right, that we find ourselves in. It's Women's Month, and today is also a day I celebrate my mom. Today is my birthday. Today is the day that she gave birth to me. And so for me, I thought it was really appropriate to invite her to help us ground. So I just asked my mom to lead us through a body scan of some of our initial moments of schooling. And I just invite you to hold on to some of her words here. Let me know if the sound is okay. Tried to embed this, but that wasn't gonna happen today. So I'm gonna play her audio and hopefully you all can hear her. And please follow through on her instructions.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. We're going to take a journey today back into a wonderful time of your life. A time when you were just beginning to be educated. I want you all to think right now, go back in your mind to a time when you were just a little one. You were 5, 4, maybe 6 years old, just beginning your education. Do you have your feet planted firmly on the ground? Do that. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to relax every part of your body. I want you to feel your fingers relaxing, your hands relaxing, your arms, your shoulders. Just let them relax and allow your heart, your spirit to journey back to that time when you were 5 or 4, 6 years old. I want you to bring up a memory, a happy memory of you as a little one, enjoying something wonderful in the newness of your education, the newness of that experience, the joy of that experience. I want you to see yourself as a little one. Do you see yourself? Where are you? What are you doing? Who is with you? What do you feel? Do you have a smile on your face? Is there wonder in your heart? Breathe in that time. Breathe in that air. You're there. Your heart has kept that memory safe for you. Your spirit has taken in all the joy of that moment so that you can experience it again today. Who's with you? Who's there beside you? Can you see them? Can you see the people around you? Or maybe it's a favorite pet, a puppy, a kitty. Who's there enjoying this moment with you? Do you feel the joy of the moment? Can you feel it in your body? Can you feel it in your heart? Allow the peace, the possibility, the wonder of that moment to wash over your being. Allow that moment to return, to give you hope, to give you purpose. There's things in that moment that are important. Important for you to remember, important for you to experience, and important for you to see. Allow the Spirit to speak to you and to guide you back to what matters the most to you. Because even from the beginning, it was being made clear to you. It was being made perfect in your heart, perfect in your mind. The joy, the wonder, the joy and the wonder will continue to guide you, will continue to inspire you, will continue to motivate you to be all that you were meant to be here in this time and in this place. I'm sending you love, peace, purpose. Selah.
So I invite you all to take a deep breath, hold, and release. With that grounding ashe. I thank my mom for taking this time and honoring this work with her ongoing work. And it's a powerful grounding for me. You know, my mom worked at the schools that I went to, and so much of what she offered in this grounding or meditation that I just heard with you all for the first time was the kind of, I say, inoculation that she attempted to provide me and my sisters at home. And ironically, it was at the school, even in kindergarten, where I first started having chinks put into that armor. And my mom quickly came to the school to work, first as a janitor, then as a person who would watch classrooms while teachers had to go to the restroom. Anything and everything she could do to be at that space, to be around us, to protect us, because so much of what the messages we were getting from the space were not in alignment with that joy and wonder that she says was embedded within our educational experiences. And I think that this is a really powerful place to delineate schooling from education. So if you were interested in a more in-depth engagement around this framework, I would recommend this piece that Dr. Tiffany Marie and I wrote in the Rootwork Journal called Apocalyptic Education, or Remembering an Apocalyptic Education. This will be a much more compacted engagement with that framework, but if you're interested, right, it's I think a piece that we tried to go into ceremony to engage, and you can find it at therootworkjournal.org. In the Journal of Black Futures, we have a follow-up to this piece coming out sometime this month that I'd also suggest. And I will send another text from Brother David Stovall around, are we ready for school abolition? I think those pieces are the invocations. Those are the prayers that bring us to the space today, for me, that I keep with my heart and try to offer to you all. And I want to begin in a very elementary sort of way. We are all orbiting around the sort of gravity of usually school or school-based communities. We've worked within education in some way, shape, or form, many of us for most of our lives. And I want to come back to the simple question of what is education? And not to insult anyone's intelligence or grounding in that, I want to give you definitions that are helpful for me. So I go to Shuja, wrote a book called Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education. Tiff and I use this in the piece to help us understand our work. And Shuja says that education is the process of transmitting from one generation to the next knowledge of the values, aesthetics, spiritual beliefs, and all things that give a particular cultural orientation its uniqueness. And that is a powerful definition, right? But it invites another question for me, right? Probably a lot of questions, but more to the point, a very specific question. If education is this process of sharing from one generation to the next, knowledge, values, aesthetics, beliefs, which Shuja's saying all of those collectively are cultural orientation or uniqueness. So education is about transmitting culture from one generation to the next. What is culture, right? What is culture? And there are all kinds of frameworks of culture. And I love to go to Dr. Barbara Sizemore, an educator who is also very influential in my life. Sizemore suggests that culture are the sum total of knowledge, ways of being, and living artifacts a people group accumulates, refines, and deploys in their struggle for survival and autonomy. She says that it's not static, right? Culture is not something that existed in the past and was cemented as a particular manifestation that then gets transmitted over and over again, that it is dynamic, that it is alive, that it is responsive to whatever may be possible threats to survival and autonomy, right? Culture must be adaptable. It must be anticipatory. Culture, in the words of Dr. Amber McZeal, is about really where we find ourselves in relationship to land. So she suggests, Dr. Amber McZeal, that people who come from places where there's a lot of mountains and trees or forested regions, their culture will take on the sort of spirit of that, such that the songs, the hairstyles, the dress, the wear will in some ways reflect information from the land, like forest or trees or mountains, right? People who come from the desert sort of areas, their culture will reflect or be manifestations of relationships to that land. So if we take those two together, and the reason why that's so powerful is because to survive, we must usually have relationship to the land. To remain autonomous, being in relationship to the land is really important too. So culture is this way of being that emerges for survival and autonomy that really leans on in relationship to land. So it's this intergenerational transmission, culture and education. Intergenerational transmission for autonomy and survival. That's education to me. Education is the intergenerational transmission for autonomy and survival. And I swear, y'all, I'm not BSing. I sat here and my mom just helped me survive a little bit more. I feel lifted. She put healing back into me. And it's a powerful invitation for me to remember that. The basis of education is about sharing, work that's going to help your people survive and move through the life that we find ourselves in. Okay. We clear on that? Just wanted to check and see if there's any space that needs to be offered. Okay. See a lot of messages that I've been missing. So I'm going to move forward if that's okay with you all, and offer these examples of passing transmission of knowledge, values, aesthetics, spiritual beliefs that help people survive. To the left, Lakota Sioux people who found themselves the children of parents who were fighting in the Red River Rebellion against the U.S. Army. In the center, these are Jamaican Maroons. These are people who were brought to enslavement spaces and ran away and developed their own life. And there still are Maroon communities in Jamaica and Suriname, other places in the world of African people who retain their culture without sort of a major interruption, but we're able to regain autonomy, regain the ability to survive in relationship to new land. Amber McZill talks about that as we come into new land, our culture will reflect that shifting, right? My people, my mom in the Louisiana, Alabama, my dad's from Kansas City, colonially referred to as Kansas City, right? And I grew up out here in Riverside, Moreno Valley, Inland Empire, and Tongva spaces in Los Angeles. And so my culture is a little bit different than my parents, right? Or our culture has had to shift a bit as we come into relationship to this land. And to the right here, we have pictures of indigenous people to what the Philippines, right? Youth and other people who are practicing their culture, practicing survival strategies, survival and autonomous based strategies. So that's education to me. It's the powerful and beautiful part of passing on this information. And I would say that most of us, I hope all of us, are down for this, right? Like, this is why we do the work, is to help proliferate and to regain autonomy, to help people survive, etc. I think that there are threats to this. And I think the threat is schooling. Threat to education is schooling, like a parasitic kind of force. So what's schooling? Going back to Shuja, it's a process intended to perpetuate and maintain a given society's existing power relations and the institutional structures that support those arrangements. So on this brief timeline, we think about what has been the power relations that we find ourselves in. Well, myself, I'm descended from people who are kidnapped, captured here, brought here, very much in any way, every way, against our will, spirit, hopes, dreams, visions, and subsisted and survived. My ancestors did, I continue to, through chattel slavery, through apartheid. We've had 57 years out of apartheid, my people. And we remain, right, in conditions of, I would say, in capture. That all that's happened, according to Derek Bell, is the way that the system has changed. The only thing that's changed, he says, in this system of domination is the sort of logistics, not its logics. So if you take that as a holding or a grounding, then you're talking about 500 plus years of ongoing resistance to being captured, to being enslaved. And then even further, if you go back to the Arab slave trade, and even further, if you go to what the Greeks were doing to African people. For indigenous people to Turtle Island, because we're indigenous not to Turtle Island, the Black people are indigenous to parts of the continent, and we've had to come into more forms of indigeneity based on our capture. But this has never ended, right? Colonial genocide, concentration removal continues. But this, what you're seeing is like overt violence shifting to more nuanced forms of violence. And in the words of Maroon Bani, you can't wake up and hit someone every single day and have that person remain. There must be a shifting of the process. And that's where I think schooling sort of comes in. We'll come back to that slide. So what, right? Like, what's the problem of this? So the problem is that if a society wants to forcibly transplant its internal logics of power and hierarchy to a different human grouping, to a different society, it needs to school and overwrite that other group's educational practices. Because remember, education is the practice of learning how to survive and to remain autonomous. And if a place like the United States wanted to interrupt African survival or autonomy, interrupt indigenous survival or autonomy, it was going to need to do school. It was going to need to replace education. And that's what we find ourselves in historically, right? This is a model that we've developed in some of the work that I've done. where we say anti-blackness, this tree sort of represents our current society. Anti-blackness is the sort of 0 degree of social conceptualization. One is either black or not black, historically speaking. And blackness becomes the reason why individuals could be treated like furniture, right? You're not human, you are chattel. And so there's a delineation point. Are you black or are you not black? And from that, it's like closer to blackness, less black, etc. And then we get enslavement. Colonization is the way this system sort of spreads across the globe. It was the process of transmission. And then white supremacy is usually what we talk about, the sort of culture that develops out of anti-blackness and out of colonial realities is white supremacy. White culture comes from this space. This we consider macro aggressions. In order to justify this violence in our world, in order for us to sit here on a, Tuesday and have a conversation, myself talking through a MacBook with minerals mined by children in the Congo, right? Trying to describe anti-Black violence again and again and again and again, right? After centuries of people who are maimed and who embody and survive trauma, but still being the request for us all is to articulate this more, right? The way that we justify it, and there's not just outright uprisings all the time, is because the institutions that emerge from white supremacy, colonization, anti-Blackness legitimize the violence. So those institutions, right? Health, housing, media, schooling, finance, criminal justice, if you don't go along with it, right? Those are institutions that legitimize violence, that say that this naked violence can become more sustained. And we look at schooling as a kind of framework for that proliferation. When I think about the work I do around microaggressions, everyday anti-Blackness in school spaces, right? Those are everyday reminders of what your people have endured through this naked violence here at the root, through the institutional violence. Microaggressions send everyday reminders. They're like the leaves on this tree, right? And so there could be 1,000 of these reminders that your people were or continue to exist in a condition of enslavement. And we're talking about anti-Blackness. We talk about everyday colonization. There could be 1,000 reminders that your people were subjected to and continue to be subjected to colonization or imperialism, right? That come out and reify the structure that goes right back down to the root. Okay, so that's what helps us understand it. Schooling was a technology going back that emerged as an institution to proliferate a kind of practice of undoing autonomy. So we trace schooling to the practice of seasoning. In books like Practical Rules for the Management and Medical Treatment of Negro Slaves in the Sugar Colonies, or in Slave Acculturation and Resistance in the American South and the British Caribbean, you get the definition of seasoning, or the practice. Slave traders and owners believed that if an enslaved person could survive a critical period of environmental seasoning, they were less likely to die, and the psychological element would make them more easily controlled. Seasoning was the process of overt physical and psychological violence done to indigenous Africans. And I want to invite folks to kind of take care of yourselves as I show some possible images of violence. But it was this practice done of violence to transform African people out of their ways of being into what they called the new Negro, into Black people, right? How do you make indigenous people forgo, forget, be severed or separated from their indigeneity? They developed a process of seasoning, of torture. And that informed what school became, right? Seasoning through schooling was intended to turn African slaves, African captives into slaves, into docile people. That was the goal, that was the format, that was the practice. Plantation management pamphlets are very clear. That's some of the original scholarship in the country is around how do you manage African people? How do you change them? So that's the basis of schooling, and it develops over time. You know, Bill Watkins and other people talk about the white architects of Black education. They describe how the original schools, even for freedmen, were centered on obedience, compliance, cultural destruction, and most importantly, pacification. And it was so effective that it became, according to Lev Paperson, the kind of work that was used against all indigenous people on the globe during the period or age of imperialism or expansion. So the violence enacted against indigenous Africans was modeled as the violence against everyone else. It became the model, right? It became the way that other people experience violence. So then again, to point out that we're going to see some images that show severing, right? That show separation or the attempted separation through schooling. These are children who were brought into a school site, the same school site, actually, the Hampton Institute, that was the first freedmen's space sponsored by the US government. So these children were, right, they attempted to transform them, to separate them, to change them, right, to undo their ways of being and overwrite them, overwrite their survival strategies, to overwrite their autonomy, right, with other ways of being. Okay. So a question that I often ask is, when did that function of schooling towards order, compliance, pacification, capitalism, cultural destruction based on anti-blackness end? When was that process that was the origin, the genesis of school, and I would say endemic and interwoven into every nook and cranny of school, of education? When did the exterminators come in and get rid of all of that? Thank you all for engaging that work with us today. I want to really briefly return. I know that our agenda has us shifting towards the case study. I wanted to just, if it's okay, contextualize a little bit more about what we just saw, and hopefully helps us go towards this case study. So the question was, what is the cost of the compromise that we make with schools, with schooling? And I think Philmon's story, along with the story of the other men in our study, and to put this into relationship to the work of The Children Can Fly, the documentary that was shown earlier during Dr. Tiffany Marie's session, we see a cost, right? A cost of compromising or schooling our young people. Philmon really had benefited from practices that we learned from Dr. Tiffany Marie, our colleague Aaron, and other educators in our apocalyptic ed framework or network work that's being done with young people in the Bay Area. I met Tiff when I was presenting the research that you just saw, and we had not yet shared with the young people practices that could possibly work towards healing their telomeres. It was really important to me to document the truth of anti-blackness. And when you apply anti-blackness to the framework of school, right, the institution of school as a part of anti-blackness, we know that the everyday practices that were always intended to undermine Black autonomy and to stifle Black survival was found in the curriculum, in grading, in pedagogy, right, in testing, punishments, and rewards. Really important. And the rewards. And what I learned in coming into relationship with the folks in the Bay who were doing this incredible work is that and it's very simple, right? When you start to get rid of the ways that schooling has parasitically mapped onto and tried to override education, you just dismantle those and replace, not even replace, but put back into place or remember what education always has been, then the harm is also interrupted, right? So here's Philmon in June of 2018 at the end of the documentary. What was so powerful as he went back to Eritrea and got into relationship with remembering his practices, remembering that he was a blessing, that he had a sacred purpose, right? That he had this cultural medicine that could heal him. His telomeres sort of got frozen in place. And then we've been in relationship and community throughout this time. So as I'm learning about what's going on in the Bay, and we see these young people whose telomeres are increasing, as maybe you saw from the previous documentary. We share that with Philmon, and he doubles down on practices, procedures. Although he is grounded in school, he doesn't do school, right? And he releases the kind of expectations to perform, conform, comply, right? To attune his whole being towards this place of harm. And as our research suggests, that when we affirm ancestral wisdom, connection to the natural world, and a balance of mind, body, and spirit health, we're able to see this vital restoration of our bodies and the regrowth possibly of telomeres. So this is Philmon in October 2020. This is where his telomeres were. And he's older, several years older, has been through housing insecurity, lost people in his life. All of those horizontal ACEs, ACEs that track horizontal violence, were visiting his life at the time. And yet his telomeres did not deteriorate. They actually proliferated. They regrew, or they were restored. And that's really important because that is in conversation with, you can think of this as a sort of follow-up to the work that was done with young people in the Bay. And I think that the problem is that getting us from one place to the next, right? Interested in what the definition of freedom is, and how you define freedom and why freedom is so important. You got to ask people who are enslaved. They'll tell us, right? They tell us what is freedom, why you need it, why it's so important. And I think that we are in transitions between freedom and encapturement or colonial reality. And I think we make these compromises because the world that we're in says that you must go to school, you must do well in school in order to get the things that you need to survive. Now that is I would say, a perversion of what education is, which is you get educated, right, for the purposes of survival and autonomy. And what the state or colonial reality or plantation regimes or the ongoing imperial state we find ourselves comes in and says, hey, we're going to replace what you've done to support yourself with our logics. And so this is a slide that helps me reorient ourselves. And so we wanted to frame a kind of case study around this concept. And Ori, I don't know if I should continue going or pass it off to you. Keep going? Okay. So we're wanting to invite us to think about this in case study, right? About this compromise, because we know that schools have this harmful reality, or at least I didn't see all the chat, but no one said, you know what, that ended. All of that stuff in school, it's gone. We got rid of it. That was like what year was the Brown v. Board, right? 1954. No, it was 65, 64. No, it was, right? No one said there was a year, a time, a place, or a practice that got rid of all of it. But we continue to compromise. Our orientation is toward testing grades, right? Getting folks into college because the state says that's what food is, because the state says that's what a house is or home is, because the state says that's what will get you clothed. And I just say, what if we interrupted that mythology? Because it's not even true for many of us, right? Getting a college degree does not necessarily lead to more stability, security, a home, right, of your own. It does not lead to psychological wellness, does not lead to all these things that even public health folks say it's a social determinant of health. I think that we've kind of mistaken the forest for the trees. There was a lot of policy passed in the 1960s, not just integration, but policies to move the country from being an apartheid state to a post-apartheid state. Are you all with me? And it seems like we've taken the policies and almost conflated those down and melted them down into, oh, people got school, they got education, they got college degrees. But that was never really what shifted the movement of more Black people or Indigenous folks out of more of us in abject poverty into middle class status. So that's a strange compromise for me. So our case study, in just a minute, we're going to invite folks into small discussion groups. In these small groups, you'll have an opportunity to introduce yourselves and identify a note taker. A discussion moderator will pose 3 questions in which you will have 15 minutes, we'll say 10 minutes to discuss, 10 to 12 minutes. And upon returning to the full group, we will share out possible solutions, further inquiry, and significance to healing our school communities. One thing to think about is this sort of broader ecological model, right? That will be helpful as we think about the questions that's going to come up. Ancestors, legacy supports, policy, and structural change form the kind of grounding, or I think of a structured foundation. And then systems and institutions would be like district supports, student supports, transportation, county or state office of education, public health, government, community in place, after school programs, community and cultural centers, faith-based environments, parks, nearby clinics, recreation, childcare, and finally individual interpersonal, be in students, educators, families, neighbors, site leaders, support staff, etc. Think of this system, this ecological reality when we ask the question, right? That's going to ask us to try to problem pose a bit. So our case study is this. You have been invited to work on a committee that has been empowered to reimagine or to imagine different educational experiences for our students based on the premise that they are blessings, that they have a sacred purpose and are grounded in their cultural medicine. So essentially you're invited to take us back to education's root. Your body scan that we did earlier with my mom is a guide for how this new, or really old, if you think about it, educational experience should feel for students. And you could take your imagination wherever you want. It could be early childhood ed, K through 12, middle school, 20 plus, I work with college students and beyond. So please develop an initial plan, thinking about those different levels of the framework. You can attack, your plan to any of the levels to shift our infrastructure. That is food, shelter, clothing, apparatuses, or vehicles that are needed in order to ensure that this new model will not compromise student wellness. So to try to make it even more clear, you have a blank canvas, right? You get to create. And the idea is that you're going to create something that ensures that the original purpose of education is back on board. The challenge that we have collectively is what will we need to ensure infrastructure-wise, food, shelter, clothing? What are the systems? Where do we have spaces to intervene to ensure that when we create this new ed model, we're not telling young people, you will be harmed a little bit so that you can get food. We have to harm you a little bit. We have to undo a little bit of your understanding of yourself a blessing, or interrupt your sacred purpose so that you can get shelter. What will we need to do in our infrastructure to shift that? I hope that's clear or makes some sense. So I'm wondering if we can shift to this. So any clarifying questions? Is there anything that help you better understand or challenge or the context better before we go into breakout groups?
All right, it looks like there are no further questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. A quick heads up, if you have only a few people in your room, like 2 or 3 people in your room, feel free to come back to this main room and we will go ahead and reassign you to a new room. So the rooms are open, feel free to join.
Wanted to thank you again for engaging, and I hope that your conversations with each other were helpful and sort of thinking through some of what we shared. Just really interested in what you came up with, what solutions resonated with you, why, any of the other sorts of important, helpful, innovative approaches that you all were able to talk through. And feel free to share verbally or in the chat.
Well, this is Oscar.
I'll go after.
I would put out on our group. I think an interesting thing we came up was to change the paradigm, if you will. I know it's an overused term, is that maybe we should start with asking students, what do they want to learn? And giving them the ability to create their own journey and pathway based upon project learning as opposed to a defined curriculum. So it's giving them, identifying, being creative and understanding what they want to learn, and giving the opportunity to do that by applying it in a real world way so that it has meaning. And you can be teaching, if you will, math and English, but it's the application of that in a way that they can understand it. You give them opportunity to have a safe place to do their work with caring adults surrounding them, and give them the opportunity to engage at their own space and time, and the freedom then to integrate all of this. And it's not so much education, but it's learning skills and how to be critical thinkers based upon where
Yes.
in this world.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, starting with students and what they want to learn, it's really, really important. Other thoughts that came up for folks?
I'm from group 5, and so I'll read from our notes of what we came up with when looking at how we would look at the case study and how it affects the students. And so one of the things that was brought up was being able to have leadership that relates and looks familiar to the student, to be able to engage with someone that is familiar and has the same like-minded approach as even the students would have within their environment and within their culture. We talked about socialization can affect any child. What kind of education does the student have access to? Also, what is the resources that are presented for the students in their environment? Outside factors that affect how the students learns, and given access to help and resources. And then one of the things that we said that should be added to help with challenges and disparities within the school system of what services that they would have access to would be like school-based mental health, and then self-care with different cultural practices.
Shay, thank you for that. Do we have time for
Go ahead.
one more person? Yeah.
Ooh,
I was in group
okay.
1 along with
I'm sorry.
Ariana and Jennifer, Francesca, and Karen. And some of the things that stood out in our discussion was Karen talked about how important it is to reframe what success means. You know, everyone has a skill set that's valuable, and it's not all about one particular thing that's the most important thing, like, you know, being a lawyer or a doctor. You can be successful without, falling into any of those normal ideas of success. And then Jennifer talked about how important representation is for children, and she's a school social worker, and she mentioned that when she was in school, she didn't have anyone who looked like her that made her believe that she could be, successful and important, and who actually saw her. And so I think um, what we got out of that was how important it is for children to be seen and to be allowed to grow organically, without being forced into certain square, pegs, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Sade?
Is it okay? Yes, thank you, Mr. Watson. Hello, everyone. I cannot remember our group number. However, we decided to discuss perhaps having a holistic approach, primarily because of the video that kind of stuck out where the gentleman was just kind of really stressed out with school, and he ended up, getting an illness from that. So perhaps, for the cafeteria menu, perhaps having some plant-based options. If there were anything that were happening on campus, we could have meditation workshop, yoga workshop, something to basically focus on the wellness of the youth. Another thing that we mentioned I can't remember the young lady's name, but she mentioned something about perhaps having like a garden on campus. Of course, that would encourage healthy eating. I thought that was an excellent addition. So yeah, so it's basically looking from the aspect from a holistic approach for their overall well-being.
Great, thank you. Really important themes around holistic wellness, centering student learning, and representation kept coming up as well. I want to just offer briefly before we shift to sort of next steps for the work that you all will be doing, just to invite a reflection upon that kind of compromise that we were sort of alluding to, right? Philmon, when he went home to Eritrea, he went home with a degree in hand, right? His grandmother didn't know or really make that a big deal, right? He was a blessing regardless of what he had done or how he had performed in school. Another really important knowing or wisdom from Philmon's journey is that he wanted to be a pharmacist, and he's on his way to becoming a pharmacist. And when he went home, people who had never heard of him or met him before saw him and said, you're a healer, right? We see you. We see what your energy is, your spirit is. You are a healer, right? Which is to say, they recognized his sacred purpose, regardless of what Western school required for him to try to walk in that path. And then finally, as far as cultural medicine, Philmon, was harmed by the health system. He's had blood in his stool since he was 15 years old. They told him to stop eating hot Cheetos, right? They thought that was why there was redness in his stool. He had a healthy diet throughout. It was really tied to the stress that he was experiencing and sort of, as he mentioned, social isolation and things like that. And so trying to shift a bit about where we find the locus of harm or nexus of harm, who's doing the harm, how are we being harmed? And that means where do we kind of attack? So if you think that tree model, hack away at the branches, you could even hack away at the leaves, but you got to uproot its foundation. Otherwise it'll keep proliferating or growing. So those are just some invitations going forward. And I appreciate you all engaging me today and engaging my mom, and just thank you so much for this blessing this space that you're holding with us all. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to other folks here. Oh, wanted to hear from Malcolm, but we'll pass it off to others.
Thank you so much, Ken, just for that presentation. And happy birthday again. And so feel free to show him some love in the chat, everybody. So after today's session, here are some questions that you can think about, what's coming up for you. How did today's session expand your understanding of what young people need? How will you put what you learned today into practice? And what questions and needs do you still have? Next slide. And for the next week, these are some questions to ponder or just to think about in between this session and next week's session. How did it feel to be part of this conversation? What surprised you or challenged you from today? And what did this content make you wonder? And you can feel free to use either a journal or the Jamboard that we have been using for this entire community of practice. If Jessica can put that in the chat, that'd be great. Next slide. And so thank you all for joining, for trusting us, for building with us, and for creating this community. Next slide. So our next session will be on Tuesday, March 15th, and this will be focusing on centering wellness while humanizing school systems change. And then our last session will be on March 22nd, and that'll focus on application and integration. And all of our speakers so far and for next week will be at this session for future learning. Next slide. And we have been soliciting case studies from you all. We want to be able to share case studies so that so that you all can discuss solutions to real world experiences during these breakout sessions. If you are open to sharing a dilemma that you've witnessed or experienced related to racial violence, feel free to email me at rcanelo@stanford.edu. And I'm going to go ahead and just put that in the chat real quick, and we can move on to the next slide. And then one thing about our services being free of cost is that we ask you to complete a short 2-minute evaluation. You can feel free to scan the QR code or use the link right here. Jessica will put that link in the chat. And this is so that we could receive funding to continue this work free of cost. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, you can connect with the MHTTC in your region. You can access their products and resources by going to the website below. Jessica, again, thank you again if you could put that in the chat. And you can feel free to interact with those centers that service your region. So with that, thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day and have a great week. And we'll see you next time.